Okay, we're really excited to start this conversation here today. So thank you for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're coming from. My name is Tania White, and I'm a design researcher here with Hugo, which is Corgan's Research and Innovation Department. And today we're going to be hosting our second webinar episode in a four-part series that discusses our most recent COVID-19 best practices report. As we all know, COVID-19 has made us pretty acutely aware of the buildings we occupy, how we interact with space, and the general role that architecture is playing in our lives. And after months of isolation and very limited public interaction, cities are preparing to reopen, or perhaps they're already in that process. But there is a certain level of trust that now needs to be reestablished as we prepare for this return. And as designers, we were really curious what our role could be in this process. We've learned that trust is not a specific trait or characteristic. You are not suddenly trustworthy. Trust is a process that requires long-term preparation and is reinforced over time through different mechanisms like information transparency, collaboration, and flexibility. And so today we've invited a group of panelists from across our different studios here at Corgan to discuss our COVID-19 research and how we can build trust through design in a post-pandemic world. So before we get started, why don't we get to know everyone who's come here to join us today, and we can let everyone introduce themselves. So Lauren, let us know a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, Tania. So excited to be here. I'm Whitney, and I help lead up our workplace wellness initiative at Corgan. I'm also part of the interior studio in Dallas. I'm a vice president, and I'm just really looking forward to this conversation about trust, of how we can streamline it with wellness and also implement it from an interior design point of view. So thanks.
Great, we're excited to have you here. We also have Jana Skidmore here. How are you doing?
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for joining me in this conversation. It's a very interesting conversation we're going to be engaging in today. I'm Jana, and I am in the healthcare sector, and I work from the Phoenix office, so I'm looking forward to our dialogue today.
Thanks, Jana. Welcome from Phoenix. I know you're a couple hours ahead of us. Hi, Talene Kibadker. We're happy to have you here. Let us know a little about yourself.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for having me. My name is Talene. I'm an aviation planner with Corgan's aviation team based in Dallas. I focus on airport terminal planning and programming efforts. I work with our designers to ensure that the terminal building is operationally efficient, well integrated with the airfield and other on-airport facilities, and meets current and future needs of the airport and its users. And I look forward to this conversation about trust.
Great, and we know the aviation industry is dealing with a lot right now, so we're excited to hear your perspective. JT, you're here from Orlando. How are you doing?
Hi, Tanya. My name is JT Jacobs. I'm a project manager and vice president with our data centers practice, and I'm out of Orlando. And really just excited to be here and participate in our conversation today. Thank you, Tanya.
Great, and last but definitely not least, Alexandra Markey. How are you doing today? Oh, there might be a mute.
Let's see.
There you go. Oh, yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Senior Associate with Corgan. I'm joining from Atlanta, and I'm thrilled to be part of this team today.
Great. Well, thanks again. We know everyone's time is super precious, so we really appreciate y'all being here to have this conversation. We hope it'll be a rich one. So Alexandra, why don't we get started off with you? You recently co-authored an article that discusses how we can design for trust and help build confidence as we return to work. And so we'd love to just get started and hear how you define building trust within the built environment.
Sure. So at its core, trust is really a relationship between two parties. And one of those parties is putting their faith and their belief in the other party and expecting them to do the right thing. So there are a number of key drivers that can help to build trust. And some of these are things like reliability, competence, benevolence, granting autonomy, and the list goes on. And looking at the literature on trust, while there are so many different drivers, I think there's one that we see very consistently, which is the idea of transparency and openness. So I think that's one thing that's really, really critical to building trust. When it comes to the built environment, I think we can look at trust in two ways, in the short term as well as in the long term. So in the short term, I think we're really all focused on this moment that we're living in with COVID-19 and creating environments where people can feel safe, returning to public spaces, going back into buildings and feeling like the owners and operators are doing everything possible to reduce the spread of germs. So I think that's really where we are at this moment, but I think there's also a longer term perspective to trust that goes beyond this, which is really about designing buildings that are healthy and sustainable and focused on the well-being of building occupants.
I really like what you said, Alexandra, about the relationship that is the basis for trust. And as we've analyzed trust, and we can kind of break it down into the tangible aspects of trust and the intangible. You've touched on some of the tangible and how the space can create that feeling of safety. From the healthcare perspective, we've explored more of the intangible aspects of trust, where the relationships and those partnerships can really engender that trust and collaboration.
Great. This is going to be such an interesting conversation, and what is already becoming pretty clear to me is that trust is a complex process during normal circumstances, let alone in the aftermath of a global pandemic. And to add to that complexity, it's also can be defined differently depending on who you talk to, because it's rooted in a values system. But one thing that experts generally agree upon is that trust is something that is built over time. So as architects and designers, how can we contribute to this long-term preparedness and crisis management, and how does that help us establish trusting relationships? And I think maybe we can start with JT and your perspective from the data centers industry, and then I know a couple other of you will have would like to share your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so Tania, I think that's a great question. And unfortunately, I think because of this pandemic, a lot of people had to take an inadvertent leap of faith into the data center world, because they've had to come to rely on remote work, remote business applications. And so you're right, I think trust is best built over time. Unfortunately, we found ourselves in the unenviable position of being forced to trust people in relatively short order. But the good news is the industry has spent a lot of time preparing for these kinds of contingencies. I won't say that there have been a lot of plans explicitly for something like a pandemic, but they do think extensively about things like social unrest. They think about natural disasters and failures in utilities. And so there's a lot of contingency there that's been built into these systems. And the good news is, if you think of this as one collective trust fall for everybody, data centers were there to actually catch them and didn't let them hit their head on the floor as they went down. So that's a good part. I think another thing that a lot of people talk about when they talk about trust is this idea of transparency. And I think for a lot of people, what that really means is visibility and accountability. I can see the things that are going on. I'm aware of the things that are going on. Someone has decided to shine a light on something. For us, transparency is a little bit different. For the data center industry, we're transparent, not in the sense that we're trying to give people visibility into what we do, but really in the sense that we want people to kind of look through us to something more meaningful, as though one were looking through a window. And so what is that more meaningful thing in this metaphor? Usually what it is, it's those business applications or those entertainment applications that people are trying to get to. Most people aren't really concerned about the design of a data center in the back end to get their videos from Netflix. And who could blame them? I think what they really want is an experience that makes them as connected to the end product and the user as possible. And so this is one of those areas where, a lot of people are, I think, beginning, to start to look at this infrastructure and begin to understand this infrastructure. I think it's entering a broader conversation than it has been in previously, in part because people have become so reliant on it so recently. And so really, I think that's where we're looking at trust right now. I think it's a growing issue for businesses. It's an issue for individuals. They're starting to look more closely at their connectivity and availability of these services.
JT, you raised some very interesting points that correlate very strongly with the healthcare sector as well. When we talk about that preparedness, you mentioned for disasters, et cetera. Healthcare, the preparedness is a mindset as well as a mandate. And when we look back following the 9/11 event, there was concern that our hospital systems actually weren't as prepared as they could have been. And so there was an effort that was put into beefing up their preparedness and their emergency operations plans. Then once again, after Hurricane Sandy, which was at that time the second costliest hurricane that the country had experienced, they saw that not only did the healthcare organizations need to improve their preparedness, but they needed to do so in concert with each other to be able to provide a stronger infrastructure, much like you've referred to, redundancies, the ability to back each other. So there was a concerted effort put into coalitions for these organizations to work together. And we see following COVID, a grassroots opportunity to likewise improve the coalition aspect by joining as designers and architects with these healthcare coalitions, the communities, first responders, healthcare organizations, and engaging in that preparedness effort in advance of an event to increase the trust through those relationships. As a representative from the New York Emergency Office of Management said, you don't want to be meeting for the first time when you're standing in the rubble. And so we see an opportunity to partner in advance to build that trust and really build more resilient communities.
You know, I agree with Jana's points. Long-term planning and preparedness is essential to build resiliency against such threats. Now, if we think in the context of airports, airports are largely a community asset, and they're operated by multiple entities. You've got airport administration staff, TSA staff, Custom and Border Patrol for international arrivals, emergency responders, police, firefighters, airline employees, and of course passengers who are the end users. So when we develop these emergency response plans for the long term, we have to engage all of these stakeholders in the process, including community members. This does allow us to build trust and consensus so that a coordinated response can be executed during a crisis. And the aviation industry has been really good at that. Jana, you mentioned 9/11. You know, that was a big impact on aviation as well. The industry really came together after that and figured out a way to implement security screening measures inside the terminal that we know now as the TSA checkpoint. So long-term perspective is definitely important in this case.
I love that preparedness, Talene. And I think from a corporate interiors point of view, from implementing workplace wellness, that's something that's new to a lot of our clients, and trying to figure out where what might be the right path to kind of dip your toe into first steps of implementing wellness into your spaces. Because I think the long term, we're going to want to make sure that we've designed these spaces from a wellness point of view. The good news is that there have been quite a few certification programs that have already paved the way on the research and development for implementing wellness into spaces. At least 10 years on these certification programs that have already done all the legwork that we can tap into and figure out what might be best for our individual spaces that we're designing. I feel like the question we hear the most is there's just so many options. You know, which ones do we start with? You can get online, or you can look at the wellness certifications and find over 100 different options to implement, and it gets a little bit overwhelming. And I think what we've been touting as for long-term preparedness, really looking at building systems from clean air, clean water for people in the spaces, and combining that with cleanliness as well. There's also in the building standard a specific feature or credit that aligns with emergency preparedness for natural disasters, technology, any human-caused emergencies, which I'm sure we'll continue to have those, and just planning to make sure that we're making safe buildings and thinking about the wellness of the people that are going to be included in that. And then outside of the tangible from the built environment, for corporate environments as well, looking at that organizational transparency. Jana had mentioned kind of, having that clarity and of transparency of what the leaders of the space are doing. So digging into equity programs such as Just or B Corp, a corporation, can help partner with the built environment that we're looking at and those non-tangible factors that we can kind of put together to help make sure that we're putting our best foot forward for the future for that long-term preparedness.
Absolutely. These are all some really fascinating responses. And so, on one hand, we have this long-term preparedness that helps build trust. But on the other hand, many emergencies and crises are they emerge unexpectedly, and they're things that we've maybe never seen before, and we don't always know what we don't know. And so that requires, a certain set level of flexibility to address these unique circumstances. And so a good example would be we're going to be very prepared for another outbreak of COVID, but a next pandemic might be an entirely different virus with a whole new set of challenges that we've maybe never seen before. And so as designers, how can we promote flexible design solutions that also reinforce trust and reliability in that immediate aftermath? And Alexandra, I know you have a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience with these flexible design solutions in interior spaces. So why don't you share your thoughts on that?
So hopefully with my headphones, you can hear me a little better now.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. So yeah, I think when it comes to flexibility, one of the really simple things we can do is to incorporate graphics and signage. And we can really use that those as a way of helping to reinforce trust. As people are beginning to return to public spaces, we're having to adopt a new set of behaviors and move through our environment a little bit differently in terms of social distancing and touching surfaces differently. And so I think signage can really help with that, helping people to relearn these new behaviors and guiding us as we re-enter these spaces. And the great thing about this solution is that it's something that doesn't have to be permanent. So as these guidelines may evolve over time, we can update the signage to reflect that. And at some point, hopefully we'll be able to remove these elements completely once things go back to normal again. In terms of flexibility, I think we can also look at it from a broader perspective. So in the way that we design workplaces today, I think flexibility is so important. Just knowing that businesses are growing and evolving and changing constantly, we need to be designing workspaces that are able to easily adapt as departments grow or as business practices change. And so this is something that we're already doing pretty frequently. So an example of this might be modular furniture systems. So creating these kind of workstations and areas where people have the ability to rearrange their workspaces, reorient them, take panels up and down. We're seeing more and more furniture on casters. It just gives users that flexibility. And I think that's really useful in this current moment as people are looking to move further, create that kind of social distancing. They just have that flexibility already built into their environment.
Alexandra, you mentioned modular furniture. That instantly reminds me of gate lounge seating in airports where passengers dwell before their flight departs. Traditionally, we see fixed seating layouts in these areas, but if we install modular seating, that could be removed or rearranged to accommodate social distancing. That makes a really good case for that style of furniture. And you also mentioned signage for airports. Dynamic signage can be very helpful, not only for wayfinding, but also to communicate critical information during crisis situations. So good points.
And Tania, I can kind of chime in a bit for the data center world here. I can say that our thinking on flexibility and resiliency and contingency have changed quite a bit over the years. And really, if you look at just 15 years ago, a lot of folks were building very robust, resilient facilities because they had limited asset that they really needed to protect. Those assets had critical features in them. And at that time, there really wasn't a marketplace or an environment that yielded a lot of flexibility for the businesses that needed to host these services. And so, they built far more robust facilities, things that they felt would, on their own stand up well to potential disasters or any other contingency you might think of. But in the last decade, what we've seen is a growth and maturity in the cloud market, where now you've got a lot of access to compute in a very geographically diverse environment, not just within, say, the United States, but really across the globe. And that's just continuing to grow and mature and become more robust over time. So now people are beginning to think about, in terms of resiliency and contingency, it's not necessarily about one facility or one built environment. It's about a more holistic picture of what the market can do. And so you may have servers that are hosted in New York, and you may have hosted services in Los Angeles. And maybe as a business, you might think, well, maybe it makes sense to have some additional resources in Montreal or Mexico City, and those things can kind of pick up the slack if we have some issue in this country, especially if you have a more global footprint. So what's happening is, even though a particular facility might go down, and to be frank, I don't think anyone wants any particular facility to go down. It'll impact, some data center providers' bottom line. It's certainly not what anyone wants, and there's still quite a bit of robustness to these facilities. But for the businesses, it's becoming actually a better environment in terms of flexibility, because now you have more assets available, more infrastructure available, and these things are becoming increasingly interconnected. We're seeing more and more interconnection fiber-wise, infrastructure-wise, and I think there's going to be a growing call for the development of infrastructure in the years to come, especially with 5G coming through and some of these other technologies that are beginning to get rolled out. And the interesting thing is, really, in a lot of ways, the more faith people place in this infrastructure and the more it gets built out, the more their faith and trust is rewarded, because the system will become more robust. You're no longer subject to just a single point of failure. If you have a fiber connectivity issue, now we're in a situation where you have a mesh of fiber connectivity, or a fabric, and if you poke a hole in that fabric, the fabric is still there, and there's still alternative means of achieving your goals and your business functions. So in that way, I think it's becoming more flexible, and you'll see edge become a part of this. I think a lot of people have been hearing more about edge computing. It's a buzzword in our industry, and really, I think for most folks, what it means is, you're more directly connected. You have a more robust on-ramp to all of these cloud resources that have been built out over the last decade or so. So that's going to play a huge part. Anecdotally, as an example of this, a lot of hyperscalers, if they have a facility go down, and again, they don't want that, trust me, but if it happens, it's not the disaster that it once was. They can move those processes to other facilities if they have to, and sometimes they even do it for energy savings. I think, I had read that Google, had facilities in Denmark and in Sweden, and if the temperatures were too high in Denmark to achieve free cooling, they could actually offload some of those processes to more northern climates where there's cooler temperatures and free cooling available. So you'll start to see that more. I think you'll start to see businesses begin to diversify their IT portfolio across facilities as well.
That's really interesting, JT. And I think it also brings up an interesting point about, remaining flexible is important for crisis situations, but also with advances in technology happening so quickly that being able to pivot and adapt and incorporate that latest technological advancement is also really important. And everyone on the call also just mentioned some really great examples of how we can remain flexible in our design responses. And as we continue to dive into this topic, we're learning that trust is determined by a variety of different mechanisms. And one that I'd like to get people's thoughts on is how trust is related to communication and information transparency. We kind of discussed that earlier in the conversation. And so whether it's, providing clear signage that reminds people to maintain a 6-foot distance, or some sort of public log that shows the last time a certain area was sanitized, the type of communication that is used will depend on the setting that you're in, and ultimately the end user that is occupying that space. And so this means that restoring trust communication with employees at the workplace is going to look very different than the way you communicate in a public area like an airport. And so I thought right now we could kind of talk about how we can design solutions that are tailored to a variety of different settings and end users. And I think, why don't we start with aviation, since it has been so heavily impacted by COVID, and you can kind of lead us off, Talene.
Sure. Yeah, rightly said, aviation has been severely impacted by this pandemic. Across the globe, we saw a dramatic drop in air travel. So naturally, airlines and airport operators had to think about implementing strategies to win back passengers' trust in flying. The unique thing about airports is not only do they have large crowds passing through the facility, but they also have to stick to. One of the areas we looked at was the boarding process. I mentioned the gate lounge earlier. The passengers must feel safe in that space and of course inside the aircraft after boarding. So for the airlines to regain their trust, it's a two-part problem. First, they have to implement enhanced cleaning procedures inside the aircraft that will, create a clean environment for passengers and improve their perception of flying, that it's safe to fly again, and also allow social distancing in the gate lounge. And number two, they have to ensure that there are no delays to the flight because of the cleaning procedures. So if we talk about cleaning procedures for the cabin itself inside the aircraft, there are different ways to perform that. One is electrostatic fogging, where you spray electrostatically charged disinfectant that sticks to all the surfaces in the cabin. Second is UV light. There are devices being manufactured that emit UVC light and can be moved through the aisle of the aircraft. And Tania, you also mentioned, communication and transparency. The airline will be advertising these procedures to their passengers so that they know that it's safe inside the aircraft. On the gate lounge side, before passengers board the aircraft, the seating becomes a challenge. I mentioned earlier, flexible, low-density seating can allow social distancing. And one thing to consider here is that the low passenger demand caused by this pandemic actually makes social distancing easier, at least in the near term, in these seating areas. And it also leaves more time to clean the aircraft because not a lot of people are boarding the aircraft, so the boarding process can happen quickly. In the long term, of course, as we start to see the demand go back up again, the challenge for the airlines is going to be completing the boarding process for a high number of passengers and finish the cleaning procedures without delaying the flight. So it's really striking that balance to maintain their aircraft turnaround time. And to help with that, technology is really good. For example, biometrics, which has been around for quite some time in the airport world. Some airlines have already been testing it for boarding process at select airports. But now its adoption may get accelerated because not only does it allow faster boarding, which creates additional time for cleaning procedures, but it also enables touchless processing, which is a huge benefit for reassuring passengers. They don't have to carry a boarding pass or interact with an agent before they board. They can just walk up to a facial recognition device, get screened, and go ahead with the boarding. So this is, of course, just the boarding process that we took a look at for the COVID-19 best practices report. But there are many other areas, of course, along the passenger journey that we continue to look into to develop strategies for both design and operational strategies to accommodate social distancing, allow touchless processing, and of course for wellness of passengers.
Absolutely. It's going to be really interesting to see how the aviation industry adapts and responds, and what the short term versus the long term changes will be, what's temporary, what's permanent. And another industry that we can discuss while we're here is the corporate office setting. And Lauren, I know you have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to human behavior in the workplace. So how can we design workspaces and the appropriate communication tools that are tailored to that end user, which is very different than in an airport?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking as Talene was talking about, such the grand scale of uh, public use on things, and how those strategies can differ so much from what we're attempting to do in the corporate office. And I think a lot of that has to do, transparency for sure, but we have to balance that. A perfect example of this would be looking versus being clean. So we know we need spaces to be clean, to make them safe, but do they look clean? And if you have, I think about, as an example, like a gas station restroom. If you go into that gas station restroom and you see that list that it's been cleaned 75 times that day, but you look at the floor and you're like, ugh. Your mind isn't being comforted by that list. So how can we as designers help pick the right materials, make sure that they, they're safe to begin with? How can they be easily cleaned and maintained for that long-term effect of feeling clean, even after we're increasing all of the cleaning measures in the spaces? So pairing those two together are really important. And it's not, you can't just communicate it, you got to make the space reflect it as well. And then just looking at other industries, I think from the corporate side, we really want to make sure that we're not pushing the envelope too far and making it too sterile. We want people to feel comfortable. We want an office to feel like an office, a hospital to feel like a hospital. I think all of these market sectors, even though we have different and shared strategies to react to this global pandemic, we still need to make those spaces look like they should to make people feel comfortable. And I think from the office point of view, we haven't had a lot of messaging that we have seen over and over from cleanliness perspective. So I think we really need to hone in on where can we make the biggest impact, which areas of those spaces will people really react positively from a behavioral point of view, where we're posting that information or showing that information. So I think that's really important. And then lastly, in addition to all the cleanliness and additional efforts that we're adding on, I think it's really important from a design point of view to find ways to delight end users. People are going to be coming back to the office, if they're not there already, sometime in the next year. And I think we need to look at the kind of the yin and the yang of there's all these scary things that are happening. We're making solutions to make them better, but how can we provide that positiveness and delight and surprise end users as they come back? And branded environments, I know Alexandra had talked about this, about where can we put signage and where can we add graphics. And I think that's so important. And I think we should even take that as a next step. Our branded environments team of coming up with creative ways to inspire people as you come back to the office, make people smile through artwork. I think that is something that we really need to make sure that we're paying attention to when we move back into the office space.
I love your recommendation for delight. It's such a great word, and it brings some humanity into the picture.
For sure, for sure. There's still it's still people that we're working with at the end of the day.
Yeah. So before we wrap up this question about end users and the appropriate communication, let's look at it from another perspective. So as designers, we tend to focus on the experience of that end user, just as Lauren and Talene have just discussed. But we can also establish trust through information transparency and these more collaborative efforts with our clients. And Jana, I know you wrote about this in the COVID-19 best practices report. So what does this look like? Like, how can we hold responsibility together with our clients to create safe and trusting environments?
I think you raise a good point, Tania, that there is a lot we can do to further that trust relationship that we do have with our clients and continue to build on that. When we look at that emergency management framework that's been referenced, there are a couple of things that really tap into this idea of transparency. One of the requirements of an emergency operations plan for healthcare organizations is that it include a communications plan. And in that communication plan, it will identify the technological solutions in case there is a failure, which JT obviously could speak to. But in addition to that, there's identification of roles and responsibility and how the communication plan will be rolled out. And so when an event goes live and that command center is activated, when we have been engaged with the client throughout their entire preparedness and their planning, their mitigation stages, what that does is it enables us to be a readily available asset for them, a resource that they can tap into immediately because we are already established through those communication channels. That's one of the benefits that we can gain by collaboration. Another is, as we move through an event and past an event, we move into the recovery phase. And we have debriefing sessions where we rely on the trust that has been established in those relationships to have open and honest dialogue in those debrief sessions. And that's where we delve into the lessons learned. And those lessons learned are what inform us on what we can improve. It's the iterative cycle, like our design thinking, where we can come back to the table in the mitigation phase and say, this can be improved, further enhancing our resiliency and our solutions.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some really great points there, especially when you're talking about this idea of collaboration. I think that's so important in this moment, because as we're returning public spaces, yes, we do expect those building owners and operators to protect us. But at the same time, I think we play a really big role too as end users going into those spaces. I think we need to be trying to engage the occupants of the space to be part of that solution. So studies actually show that when people are in a stressful situation, having a sense of control over their environment can help to reduce stress levels. So I think we can take that idea and apply it to the physical environment by engaging people to be able to have some sort of control. So for instance, in a workplace, we can engage people by providing access to cleaning materials and cleaning supplies. So if people, like as Lauren touched on, if people see a space and maybe they feel like, oh, I'm not sure if this is clean, they have the ability to take control, grab those cleaning supplies, wipe down the surface, and that gives them that peace of mind. So I think that's really great. And it really, at a large scale, really helps people to have buy-in and feeling like they're part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what's becoming clear, there are a lot of things that are becoming clear in this conversation, is that, during a crisis, a lot of our clients or the people that maybe are our usual go-tos to reach out to are in the middle of chaos. And so it reminds me of that quote that you started us off with, Jana, when you're like, we don't want to be meeting for the first time in the rubble. Like, a crisis is not a good introduction. Our key contacts are putting out fires left and right. And that's because, certain industries and systems can be put under additional stress during a crisis, depending on what it is. And while we don't want to downplay that stress, we also can start to see how these disruptive events can be the catalyst for new ways of doing things, new technologies, new approaches. And we can see this when we look back at major historical events in the past. Like the Great Depression was the catalyst for our social security system, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, historians often mark as kind of the new era in globalization. And so these changes and these events can be very disruptive. People need time to learn and to trust again these new ways of being. And so this kind of brings up the conversation of behavioral shifts and how, as architects and designers, we can respond to them appropriately and how we can learn from them. And I think, again, aviation is really seeing this shift in, at least right now in the immediate. We'll see what happens in the long term. But do you have any thoughts to lean on kind of how the passenger profiles are perhaps changing?
Yeah, you mentioned behavioral shifts. I think one of them that we can expect to see, at least in the near term, is change in business travel, change in that profile. A lot of the companies are implementing work from home policies. They're investing in resources and technologies that enable remote work. And they're realizing with this pandemic that remote work is actually feasible and beneficial to an extent. This has allowed them to reduce the frequency of their business trips. I guess if we compare that to the passenger profiles at airports, we may start to see a shift there, where we see less business trips and more leisure trips, because with remote work, you could still travel anywhere and work from there. So this might affect the peak hours, especially for maybe the mid-sized O&D airports, where the morning peaks and evening peaks mainly consist of these business trips. So we may start to see those peaks change, which is something to consider, because peak demand really dictates the processing capacity of airports. Ultimately, though, demand is driven by airline flight schedules. So if the airlines add more point-to-point flights back to their schedules as the economy recovers, we might not see that change taking over in the long term as we return to business as usual.
And I think Talene brings up a really interesting challenge for the data center world. So in the beginning, when we talked about software and business applications, early on, these things were worked out to a high level of completion. They went through beta, were finished, put on a disk, and sent out. People bought it, installed it on their computer, and then it was off to the next version. But now we're seeing a conversion of this from software on a disk to software as a service, and all of that is in service to this new work environment and this new method of deploying IT that enables this remote worker. So now, not only does the product just have to work as it did before, now they have the added combination of making sure that it works all the time. And not only does it work all the time, but it works from wherever it is you're working in the first place. So if you do have these kinds of travelers that do, live the dream and sip Mai Tais on the beach while checking their email, we can all dream, and I think it's good to do that. The real question is, is our industry actually going to be able to support that kind of robust infrastructure? Is it going to be robust enough to support the needs of this new kind of business entity and new remote work arrangement?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and it really does change the way that we think about designing workplaces. Now that we know that we have the ability to really work from anywhere, it makes us reconsider what is the purpose of an office. What's the reason that we need to go into an office these days? And I think what most of us are seeing is really the fact that we're missing community, we're missing that kind of face-to-face interaction. And that's really what's drawing us back into the office right now. I think most of us have found that for, heads down kind of focused tasks, we can easily do that from home. And in some cases, we can be even more productive doing those things from home. But when it comes to things like sharing ideas and collaborating and, just feeling a sense of community and being a part of that larger culture, that's the piece that we're missing. And so I do think that as we look to the future of offices, I think our offices will be designed a little bit more with those components in mind. So we'll be really designing to support the community and the collaboration and all of those wonderful aspects of the office.
Yeah. And it really drives home the importance to stay flexible and kind of adapt to the client that you're working with and the different needs that everyone kind of comes to the table with. Why don't we shift gears really quick? So we spend a majority of this conversation talking about how trust is built and how you reinforce it, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes trust can be broken, there can be mistakes or errors, and especially during a crisis like this, systems and companies and institutions are under a lot more scrutiny than they may have been before. And so people are really examining it with a lot more detail. So what happens when trust is broken and we need to actively repair it? Lauren, I know you have a lot of experience designing for human behavior, as you've kind of been threading throughout this conversation. So what are your thoughts on how we can delicately kind of act through this?
Sure. This is the tough one, right? Mistakes.
Yeah.
No softball here. Yeah. So we've been having a lot of conversations with clients across the nation about their reentry to work. And a lot of it has been about trust. I think the first thing to think about is your own personal culture at your office, because every company is different, and the way that you would tailor the messaging would vary based on what has been previously stated before, and what aligns with that culture. I think some of the first things that we can do, just coming back into the office to help restore that trust, is as reminders of things that have already been done, that are easy wins that maybe we don't talk about a lot of times. So if there are building infrastructure positives that have already been put into place, let's bring those up. Let's remind people that, back to your point about trust being a long-term thing, let's remind them how far we've gone back previously and what we've already done before to kind of refresh people's minds about the link that the relationship that has been built. Now, what happens when trust is broken is a lot more difficult. I'd say one of the ways to help avoid breaking trust is to not speak in absolutes. As we get into change management and communication internally, just making sure that you're not making clear declarations of this is the end all be all and this is how we're going to fix this, because there's just so many variables that are unknown. So many things, from a municipality changes to government changes to education changes, that can all impact what we're communicating. And as we know, things can change, and then you got to change your message. So avoiding that, I think, is great. And then watching those human behaviors. People are going to surprise us when they get into these spaces, is the way that they act. So we really need to be paying attention to how people are reacting to their spaces as they come back in, to be able to make those tweaks before we have too many problems to be able to solve. And then just being agile on the solutions, leaving in those communications, leaving room for us to make changes as needed, and showing that human element, that we don't have all the answers, I think will build trust with people as they're hearing the message for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. And I think you touched on something interesting there too, which is that, I think everyone needs to come to the table with their own kind of solution to some degree, because the thing is, trust is a two-way street, right? So even if, say an office building is taking all of the right measures to try to protect their employees, if there's an employee that doesn't stay home when they have a fever or they're sick, then they could be contributing to, they could be impacting the health of the building. So I think it's really important to maintain that engagement from everyone and making sure that everyone is buying in and wanting to be a part of that solution. And so, as you touched on, when things do perhaps go wrong, just to make sure that we're reminding all of the people that are being part of that space that they need to be part of the solution, and then just making sure we have everyone's buy-in.
Alexandra, I love that the concept of having people buy in, because then they definitely take some ownership. Mm-hmm. One thing I think we've seen with some clients is, don't ask the questions that you don't want the answers to. If you're going to ask for people's feedback, make sure you really want it and you know what to do with it, because that can definitely break some trust along the way.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to start wrapping up. This hour is moving very quickly, and it's been really great to have so many different perspectives that really reflect just the overall cross-disciplinary approach that we took to Corgan's COVID-19 best practices report. And one thing that we've learned is that, we can look outside of ourselves for inspiration and examples, especially during times of crisis when things are shifting and moving. And during a recent podcast, After Hours, it's awesome, y'all should listen to it, there were some Harvard Business School professors who were just discussing which industries can we kind of look to and observe in these times of change. And they started talking about the sporting industry and the momentous challenge that they have ahead of them, and how, it'll be interesting to see the types of strategies that they develop to aid in their recovery. And in your article for the best practices publication, Jana, you kind of mentioned event management as an industry that we can turn to, which I thought was so interesting. And I would love to kind of open up the floor for you to be able to talk about that a little bit and how we can turn to adjacent industries for inspiration.
Sure, Tanya. I'll touch on this quickly here since we are coming to the end of our hour. But when we do look at event management, their entire process, interestingly, correlates very strongly with both design thinking and emergency management. One of the things that they rely upon heavily is logistics. They say on-site logistics are really created off-site months in advance. The other thing that they're dependent upon is flexibility, which we've discussed here in this dialogue as well. They say we are the masters of planning for the unexpected. And finally, another key aspect that they employ is defining roles and responsibilities. They say even the smallest thing that might seem insignificant, make sure someone's responsible, because when the event goes live and everybody's bandwidth is maxed out, to have those roles identified will improve. So there are some key things that we can definitely learn from them, many of which we've already discussed here today.
That's great, Jana. Yeah, it's so, I love the concept of leveraging other markets to inform our market to thrive and be better. And I think that's what's been so fun about these last couple months of really cross-pollinating across these different market sectors is we have so much to learn from each other, and this is just so much knowledge to share. From the interiors point of view, historically, we have looked a lot to healthcare and education as setting the bar for new collaboration, cleanliness, materials. So I would anticipate that to continue, especially from the education point of view, since so much will be changing with schools and the way that we're teaching. And I think that will impact collaboration. But then one other thing that I think will be fascinating for our clients that have large scale spaces or campuses is looking at the movie theater industry. How will they be preparing? I think if they can get it right to get people to volunteer to come back into a large space and sit close next to someone, then there are definitely some lessons learned that we can leverage on the corporate side.
Yeah, I like this discussion about learning from other industries. I just want to mention from airport standpoint, we are looking to the theme park industry, Disneyland and Universal Studios, the Imagineers that design those places, how they are dealing with this event and how they're gonna attract crowds back again, especially for queue management. That's one of the big things in airports that we have to deal with. So I'm excited just to see what they will do and how we can learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we all know, Disney is often at the forefront of innovation and responsible for a lot of the technologies and systems we use today. So that's really exciting. I'm glad to hear y'all are looking at that. I've been monitoring our chat during our conversation, and we have one question that did emerge, and I wanted to bring it up. And this was around the time, Talene, that you were talking about regular sanitization of aircrafts. And the question came in from, I will get the name, one second. Let's see, it came in from Drew Prochaska. And the question was, would it be incredibly cost prohibitive to have UV lights permanently installed around the cabin so that it can be disinfected with the flip of a switch anytime? So installing that as a permanent feature on the aircraft.
That's a good idea. I mean, it's really up to the aircraft manufacturers. I'm sure they are looking into this to install those permanent features for UV light. And I think one of the discussions that's been out there about UV is what that does to people when it's emitted, when people are around. But I think we're finding more and more that it's actually not that harmful. So I think that could be a great solution, instead of every time an aircraft arrives at the gate and you have to, as the passengers come out, and new passengers board, in that time in between, they have to do this UV light procedure instead of using a device. I think, yeah, there may be a possibility where we see permanently installed features inside the aircraft.
And that's an excellent reminder, Talene, that, you know, when we look at these new technologies, we always need to pause and kind of think about how it impacts not only human behaviors, but human health. And that, you know, we don't want to quickly make a recommendation without being able to fully flush through that idea. But just really understanding that technologies and people really shape one another, and it's a conversation. Look, I don't see any other questions that have come in. Last time, one more try. We can give you all back about 5 minutes of everyone's time. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm left kind of wanting to have one-on-one conversations with y'all and to continue it. And it really just reflects the collaborative effort, like we said, that we put together for our COVID-19 best practices response. If you haven't had a chance to go on our website and check out the report, and if you're on the webinar right now, we will be sending you a recording of it so that you can review it on your own time. And just before we close out, just a huge thank you and round of applause to all of the panelists here today. We couldn't have done it without you. It's been such a pleasure. And till next time.